Imagine walking through the bustling streets of ancient Rome. Marble columns rise above your head, senators in pristine white togas pass by, and vendors shout their wares across the crowded forum. But step just a little off the main road, duck into a dim alley, and you'll find yourself in a very different world, one that rarely makes it into the grand stories of emperors and battles. A world that fed the appetites of Rome's citizens in a way both tolerated and hidden, celebrated and despised. This was the shadow economy of Rome's sex slaves, the men and women whose bodies were bought, sold, and consumed in a trade that stretched from the city slums to the palaces of the elite. And today, you've found a channel that explores the hidden sexual practices of history. So if you think the Romans were only about gladiators and chariot races, think again. This is a story about lust, power, and exploitation woven into the very fabric of the empire. The Roman world was obsessed with sex, but not in the way we might imagine today. For Romans, sex was less about intimacy and more about dominance, hierarchy, and control. The freeborn Roman male could take pleasure almost anywhere he liked, as long as he remained the active, penetrating partner. Respectability was measured by who held power in the sexual act, and so, behind the empire marble facades, there existed an entire underclass of people, slaves who were forced to serve as objects of pleasure. Unlike the courtesans of Renaissance Europe or the geishas of Japan, Rome's sex workers were overwhelmingly slaves, stripped of rights and reduced to living merchandise. Most of these sex slaves were not Roman at all. They came from conquered territories: Gauls, Greeks, Syrians, Egyptians, Jews, captured in war, or sold by desperate families into servitude. A young woman from Thrace might find herself paraded in a slave market. Children were not exempt. Roman authors, speaking with chilling casualness, describe boys groomed for prostitution, prized for their youth and beauty. To the Roman elite, this was no scandal. It was simply the way of the world. Power was exercised not only on the battlefield, but also in the bedroom where the bodies of the enslaved were trophies of conquest. But what did daily life look like for these slaves? Oil lamps flickering against stone walls smeared with graffiti. Archaeologists in Pompeii uncovered several of these luminaria, with rooms barely large enough for a straw mattress. Above the doorways, explicit frescoes displayed various sexual acts, like a grotesque menu for customers. The slaves who lived and worked here might service dozens of men in a single day, their names shouted in the alleys like street vendors selling bread. They had no right to refuse, no right to set terms. For them, pleasure was something extracted, never given. But brothels were only one piece of the story. Sex slaves were everywhere, in taverns, in bathhouses, in the homes of the wealthy. Aristocrats often kept private harems, a retinue of young boys and girls who were expected to provide not only companionship, but sexual favors. Wealthy matrons, too, could exert their dominance over male slaves, using them to satisfy desires that Roman morality otherwise tried to restrict. The double standard was glaring. While a respectable Roman woman would be disgraced for adultery with a free man, her use of slaves was rarely punished. Bodies without freedom were bodies without honor, and thus they could be used without scandal. This casual brutality extended to how sex slaves were advertised. In the marketplaces of Rome, traders shouted their wares: strong backs for farm work, clever hands for accounting, and among them, soft bodies for pleasure. Price lists survive from antiquity, showing that prostitutes fetched different amounts depending on age, appearance, and perceived skill. A beautiful Greek girl might be sold for a fortune, while an older or less desirable person went for far less. For those with money, exotic slaves from the far reaches of the empire carried a certain erotic prestige, the allure of the foreign, the forbidden. And yet, even in this world of exploitation, hints of individuality surface. In Pompeii graffiti, we find names: Myrtis, who costs 2 asses, Victor, who pleases everyone. Crude as these notes are, they are among the only traces these people left behind. Brief fragments carved into stone that whisper of lives otherwise forgotten. Each name belonged to a person whose humanity was stripped away, reduced to a transaction, yet still somehow inscribed in history. The story of Rome's sex slaves is not just about cruelty. It also about how a society rationalized it. Romans viewed slavery as natural, the spoils of war, the foundation of their empire. To them, enslaved prostitutes were no different than cooks or gladiators, tools of labor, albeit in the most intimate sense. Morality did not protect them. The law did not protect them. In fact, Roman law demanded that prostitutes register and pay taxes, even if they were slaves with no earnings of their own. Imagine the absurdity. The state profited from the degradation of its most powerless people. And yet, despite all this, Rome's sexual underworld was not hidden. Taverns doubled as dens of prostitution. Even the Grand Colosseum, where gladiators fought for their lives, sometimes became a place where sex slaves were paraded or rewarded to victors. The line between entertainment and exploitation blurred, until the entire city pulsed with an undercurrent of flesh for sale. This was the world Rome built, a world where sex was both everywhere and nowhere, acknowledged but despised, normalized yet shameful. And as we move deeper into this story, we'll uncover not just the mechanics of the trade, but the psychological and cultural forces that made it thrive. Because Rome's darkest trade was more than just a marketplace of bodies. It was a mirror of an empire soul. If the first glimpse of Rome's sexual underworld shows us the brothel and the street corner, the next reveals something even more insidious. The way Rome turned sexuality into an expression of power and control. To understand the sex slave trade, we must understand Roman attitudes toward desire, shame, and hierarchy. Ideas that shaped every interaction between master and slave, citizen and prostitute, man and woman. What emerges is not just a story of physical exploitation, but a culture where domination itself was eroticized. At the core of Roman sexuality was the concept of penetrative power. A Roman male citizen honor depended on being the active partner in sex. To be the one penetrated was to lose status, to be feminized, degraded, or enslaved. This is why prostitution became a realm dominated by the enslaved. They were already dishonored, already stripped of dignity. A free Roman man might buy their services, but he could never offer his own body for sale without losing his place in society. For women, the rules were harsher. Respectable matrons were expected to be chaste, tied to the virtue of their household. Those who fell outside this boundary, enslaved women, freed women forced into prostitution, or girls raised in brothels, were cast into a permanent state of infamy. Once registered as prostitutes, they could never reclaim respectability, no matter how their lives changed. And so the sex trade was built on this rigid divide: free versus enslaved, honored versus dishonored, dominant versus dominated. Rome's appetite was vast, but it required an underclass to absorb the shame of its pleasures. Slaves provided that outlet, their humiliation both fueling and justifying the desires of their masters. Imagine the twisted logic. Because sex with slaves was considered shameful, it was safe, acceptable, because it carried no risk of tarnishing the honor of freeborn citizens. It was precisely their lack of dignity that made them usable. But beyond the ideology, there were physical structures that enforced this world. They were designed to maximize profit with tiny cubicles, stone beds covered with straw, and erotic frescoes above each doorway. Picture the claustrophobic atmosphere. 10 rooms lined along a corridor, the sounds of commerce and moaning bleeding into one another, the smell of sweat and wine mingling in the air. For the slaves inside, this was their entire world, their labor unending, their bodies both the workplace and the product. And then there were the taverns, places of cheap wine, gambling, and prostitution. Here, sex slaves were often rented out by the hour, sometimes in semi-public spaces behind curtains or in shadowed alcoves. The Roman poet Juvenal sneered at such places, describing drunken men pawing at slaves while dice clattered across tables. To him, this was the filth of the city, but for thousands of enslaved women and men it was daily survival. Not all sex slaves lived in brothels. Many were kept privately, hidden away in the domus of the wealthy. A senator might own a Greek boy prized for his beauty, or a noblewoman might keep an African slave as a lover. These arrangements blurred the line between coercion and intimacy, but at their core, they were still built on ownership. No matter how affectionate a master might seem, the slave had no choice, no freedom to refuse. Ancient authors even record instances where slaves were forced to compete for their master affection, a grotesque parody of romance played out under the shadow of compulsion. And yet not all Romans viewed this system without discomfort. Philosophers like Seneca warned against overindulgence, cautioning that the use of slaves for pleasure corrupted the soul. Others wrote moralizing critiques of prostitutes, condemning them as symbols of decadence. But rarely, if ever, did they question the institution itself. The problem was never the existence of sex slavery. It was the risk of excess, the fear that indulgence would weaken Rome's moral fiber. In other words, the concern was always for the free citizens, never for the enslaved. This moral blindness created a culture where exploitation became normalized entertainment. Graffiti in Pompeii reveals how customers bragged about their encounters, boasting of conquests over women whose names are forever etched in stone. Even the gods themselves were drawn into the trade. Venus, goddess of love, was invoked in brothels. Religion did not condemn prostitution, it sacralized it, weaving it into the divine order. And perhaps most disturbingly, the Romans turned sex slavery into spectacle. At feasts, masters might force their slaves to perform erotic dances or acts before guests. At public festivals, prostitutes paraded alongside entertainers, blurring the line between ritual and exploitation. In some accounts, even gladiators, already slaves of the arena, were made to serve sexually when not fighting for their lives. The body of the enslaved was always public property, always available for use, always subject to the gaze and desires of others. So how did the sex slaves themselves endure this? Ancient texts are silent on their voices. We must read between the lines, through graffiti, price lists, and scattered references. Some may have carved out small measures of agency, manipulating their roles to earn favor or money, perhaps even buying freedom one day. But for most, the cycle was endless, their lives consumed by labor until age or disease rendered them useless. And when that day came, they were often discarded, replaced by fresh captives from Rome's never-ending conquests. It was part of the urban fabric, woven into every tavern, every bathhouse, every villa. The empire power rested not only on legions and taxes, but on the exploitation of human bodies in their most intimate form. But a public institution, regulated, taxed, and embedded in the machinery of the Roman state itself. On the contrary, it was a system that the empire actively profited from, a trade that was legalized, taxed, and regulated as if it were any other branch of the economy. To understand how deep this ran, we need to look at the intersection between power, money, and the bodies of the enslaved. Roman law treated prostitution with brutal clarity. Prostitutes, whether enslaved or free, were classified as infames, people of dishonor, stripped of legal protections and social standing. Once registered in this category, there was no way out. Somehow gained freedom. The law branded them as permanently tainted, unworthy of respect. And yet, despite this stigma, the state eagerly collected taxes from their labor. For the enslaved, this was a cruel irony. They had no income of their own, yet the empire demanded profit from their degradation. Inscriptions and legal texts suggest that tax collectors specifically targeted brothel owners, pimps, and tavern keepers. The sums might seem small by modern standards, perhaps a few denarii per person, but across the vast empire, the revenue added up. Prostitution became a steady stream of income, another resource Rome extracted alongside grain from Egypt or silver from Spain. The empire literally built itself on the backs of the enslaved, not only in the fields and mines, but in the bedrooms and brothels as well. But the trade extended beyond taxation. Slave dealers specialized in the sale of pleasure slaves, marketing their captives with chilling precision. Surviving records describe youths praised for their beauty, women advertised for their skills, exotic foreigners sold as luxury goods for the wealthy. In the bustling slave markets of Delos or Rome itself, traders shouted out the qualities of their stock: strong, obedient, skilled at music, and without hesitation, skilled at sex. Buyers knew exactly what they were purchasing, and sellers made no attempt to hide it. For the wealthiest Romans, this market offered endless possibilities. Some collected entire harems, filling their villas with girls and boys from every corner of the empire. These harems were not simply private pleasures, they were displays of status. To own an Ethiopian slave, a Greek slave, a Syrian slave, was to flaunt one reach and wealth, to make a sexual spectacle of Rome conquests. Guests at dinner parties might be offered access to these slaves, their bodies turned into instruments of hospitality. The trade was not just personal, it was social, political, performative. And then there was the darker side, the forced training of young slaves into sexual roles. The satirists and moralists mock these practices, but their very existence suggests a systemic industry, not isolated cases. Imagine a world where childhood itself was shaped into preparation for exploitation, where innocence was deliberately stripped away in service of profit. The psychological toll must have been immense. While ancient texts rarely give us the voices of the enslaved, we can glimpse their suffering through hints in literature. Some slaves attempted escape, risking brutal punishment. Others carved graffiti, leaving behind bitter jokes or cries for recognition. Life expectancy for sex slaves was short, and their replacements were always readily available, shipped in from the frontiers where Rome legions waged endless war. And yet, this exploitation existed alongside a strange fascination. Roman literature is filled with erotic poetry, bawdy jokes, and scandalous tales that glamorize the very trade that destroyed lives. Writers like Martial and Ovid played with imagery of brothels and courtesans, turning pain into entertainment. The divide between reality and representation was stark. While the slaves endured misery, the elite consumed fantasies of their bodies in art and verse. Sex slavery was not just an economic system, it was a cultural obsession. This obsession even crept into religion. Temples to Venus, Bacchus, and Priapus were often located near red light districts. Festivals dedicated to fertility included sexual performances, sometimes with slaves as the unwilling participants. By linking pleasure to the divine, Rome blurred the line between piety and exploitation. Even the gods seemed to sanction the trade, their imagery decorating the very spaces where humans were violated. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of all is how normalized this was. Unlike later Christian societies, Rome did not attempt to abolish prostitution. There were no purity crusades, no sweeping reforms. Instead, the empire accepted it as inevitable, even necessary. Moralists might complain, philosophers might warn of excess, but the machinery of sex slavery rolled on, unquestioned. It was as much a part of Roman life as bread and circuses, another spectacle in a society built on spectacle. The result was a paradox. Prostitutes and sex slaves were despised, yet indispensable. They were shamed, yet endlessly desired. They were stripped of humanity, yet central to the functioning of the empire. And this paradox reveals something essential about Rome itself. Its greatness was inseparable from its brutality, its glory shadowed by cruelty. Every triumphal arch, every feast, every temple was funded by a system that commodified human life in every possible way, including its most intimate aspects. As we turn to the final part of our story, we must ask, what legacy did this leave? When Rome fell, did the trade vanish with it, or did it transform, carrying its shadows into the world that followed? The answer takes us beyond the empire borders and into the long afterlife of Rome's darkest trade. The fall of Rome did not erase its darkest trade. The structures of sex slavery lingered long after the empire collapse, shaping medieval Europe, influencing Christian morality, and echoing even into our modern world. To understand this legacy, we must see how the Roman system of exploitation laid foundations for centuries of sexual commerce, stigma, and control. As Christianity rose to dominance in the late empire, attitudes towards sex shifted dramatically. Where Rome had viewed prostitution as a necessary evil, the church saw it as sin. Yet paradoxically, prostitution did not vanish. Instead, it was rebranded, regulated, and moralized in new ways. Church fathers condemned prostitutes as fallen women, but they also argued that brothels prevented greater sins like adultery or sodomy. Augustine famously declared that prostitution was like a sewer in the city, disgusting, but necessary to keep filth from spilling into the streets. This echoes Rome pragmatism. The trade was despised, yet preserved. What changed was the status of the prostitute herself. Under Rome, she was an infamous, legally dishonored. Under Christianity, she became a sinner, morally damned. The shift was profound, turning exploitation into a matter not just of law but of salvation. Sex workers were targeted for redemption campaigns, confined to reform houses, or used as cautionary tales in sermons. Yet the underlying dynamic, the commodification of female and enslaved bodies, remained. The language of stigma also endured. The idea that sexual labor left an indelible mark, that once tainted a woman could never return to respectability, is a Roman inheritance. So too is the double standard. Men could indulge without consequence, while women bore the full weight of shame. These ideas seeped into Western culture so deeply that they shaped gender norms for centuries, long after Rome marble had crumbled. But Rome influence was not confined to Europe. Through conquest and trade, its model of sexual exploitation spread across the Mediterranean and beyond. In the Byzantine East, in the Islamic caliphates, in medieval Spain and Italy, echoes of Roman systems appear: regulated brothels, taxed prostitution, slave concubines imported from distant lands. Each culture adapted the practice to its own moral codes, but the economic logic remained the same. The bodies of the powerless could always be turned into profit. The frescoes of Pompeii, the poetry of Ovid, the graffiti of brothels, all of these fueled both titillation and scholarship. To some, Rome became a symbol of decadent pleasure; to others, a warning of moral collapse. The image of Rome prostitutes haunted Western imagination, shaping debates about sexuality, vice, and virtue well into the modern era. But beyond the art and literature, we must remember the human cost. The individuals whose lives were consumed by this trade rarely left voices of their own. We reconstruct their world through fragments: graffiti, legal codes, archaeological remains. But their suffering remains largely invisible. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all: the silencing of the exploited, the normalization of their absence in history. Rome's darkest trade thrived because society accepted their erasure, because power depended on forgetting the humanity of the enslaved. Today, when we talk about sex trafficking or exploitation, we are still grappling with shadows cast by Rome: the commodification of bodies, the double standards of morality, the uneasy relationship between legality, profit, and desire. All of these trace back to patterns established 2,000 years ago. Rome may be gone, but its logic lingers, shaping our debates about sex work, freedom, and consent. And so we arrive at the end of this story. From the bustling brothels of Pompeii to the grand villas of senators, from the taxes collected by emperors to the stigma enshrined in law, the story of Rome's sex slaves is one of cruelty hidden in plain sight. It is a story of power and humiliation, of desire twisted into domination, of human beings reduced to instruments of pleasure. It is, in short, the story of an empire that built its glory not only on conquest and architecture, but on the exploitation of the most intimate aspects of life. If this journey shocked you, if it unsettled your image of Rome, then perhaps it should. Because history is not only triumphs and monuments, it is also shadows and secrets, the lives erased so that others could live in luxury. And here on this channel, we uncover those hidden histories of sex and sexuality, shining a light on the truths that textbooks often overlook. So now I want to ask you, which fact surprised you the most? Was it the graffiti of Pompeii, the taxes imposed on brothels, or the way sex slavery shaped culture for centuries afterward? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your reactions. And if you want to keep exploring the forbidden, the forgotten, and the fascinating side of history, make sure to subscribe because there are many more stories waiting to be told. Until next time, remember, the past is never as distant as we think, and its shadows often reach into our present.